everyone, I'm Kelly and thanks for joining me today for a discussion of gauge. And first off, let me apologize for the imperfection of this video. I'm a crocheter, not a videographer, but we're going to do our best here. What gauge is that every crocheter holds their yarn and their hook slightly differently and so comes up with a slightly different finished item. If you handed 10 crocheters the same pattern, the same yarn, the same hook, all of them would be a slightly different size when they were created. And so when you're following a pattern, a designer will give you a gauge which will tell you exactly the size of their stitches so that you can try and match that size. And if you don't match that size naturally, you can change your hook, maybe your yarn, and probably your technique a little in order to match their gauge swatch and therefore match the size of their finished item. We did encounter this briefly in my yarn video when we looked at the label on the back where it gave us a little square that said that the person who created this for this yarn company used a 5mm hook and made a square 16 inches or 16 single crochets across, 28 rows tall, and that came out to a 4x4 inch square. And that's the type of thing that's going to be at the beginning of every pattern. The designer will tell you how many stitches and how many rows equals a desired measurement, and then you need to try to match it. And making a little practice swatch before every pattern kind of sounds tedious, and you may be thinking, do I really need to do that? And the answer is usually. Let me give you a quick example of something where it doesn't matter as much. Let's say you're making a scarf and you don't really care if your finished item is a little shorter or longer or thinner than the designer's, and you have plenty of yarn on hand. In that case, you can probably get away with just using the recommended hook. But let's say that you only bought the exact amount of yarn the designer called for in their pattern, but each one of your stitches is slightly bigger than the designer's stitches, then you're going to run out of yarn before you get done. So in that case, even though you don't really care about the size of the finished item, you still need to check your gauge so that you don't run out of yarn. But the time when it really matters, if you get gauge and get the exact right gauge, is when you're making clothing or other items that really need to fit. I've written out a quick example here that I think will be easier if you just pause and read it and let it sink in. But I just wanted to show you that something where your gauge swatch is only 1 stitch off can come up with a final project that's over 4 inches off. So let's talk about how to create a gauge swatch, how to measure a gauge swatch, and how to make adjustments so that your gauge can match the designer's gauge. Okay, so what I have here is I have created a half double crochet swatch. In this case, let's assume that I am the designer. I have created an item and now I need to tell everyone what my gauge was so that they can recreate it. And this part is pretty straightforward. We'll just put a measuring tape down and count the number of stitches. It doesn't have to be in 4 inches, but that is a pretty common way it's measured. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then both as a designer and as a consumer, you would want to move your tape measure around to several spots on the swatch. Make sure you didn't just hit a fluke. Make sure it's good and consistent. So I have 12 stitches across. And then for the rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I would tell my consumers that my gauge for my pattern is 12 stitches across and 11 rows equals a square 4 inches. And so you, as the consumer of my pattern, would make your own gauge swatch to try to match that. Now you don't want to just make 12 stitches across. You want to make something more like what I've made here that's several stitches bigger than that, because your bottom row and your edge stitches often are not quite as consistent as the middle, so you want to measure here in the meat of your swatch. So what do you do if it doesn't match? If you have too many stitches across, that means each of your stitches is too small because more fit in the 4 inches. So you want to go up a hook size so that hopefully you'll get the right number of stitches. If you have too few stitches in the 4 inches, that means that your stitches are too big and you want to try going down a hook size. And you do always want to try to match the number of stitches across first by changing your hook size, because it's easier to change the row size with this really great tip that I'm about to share with you. This is the most important thing that I've learned since crocheting. Before I knew this tip, I was unable to follow anyone else's patterns because I could never match their gauge. And so let me show you my favorite tip, which is called the golden loop. So on a half double crochet, if I insert my hook, yarn over and pull up a loop, that loop right there is your golden loop. And you can control how big your stitches are by how far you pull up that golden loop. Here I'm just barely going to pull it up past the row below, and that'll make a very short stitch. We'll do a few of those, just barely pulling it up. But then I can also pull it up very, very tall and make a very tall stitch. Oops. And you can see the difference between these few stitches and these few stitches, how much taller those are. And that's how you could adjust the height of your rows if you didn't quite have the right amount. And I also want to point out, if you're getting really close, but you're still off just a smidge, you can also adjust your tension to make some changes. And that tension is how hard you pull on that yarn right there. If I pull that nice and taut, that'll make some nice tight stitches. But if I leave that kind of loose and floppy, it'll make looser, bigger stitches. And so I just want to show you a couple pieces I've made. These are each the same yarn, the same hook, the same number of stitches, and the same number of rows. Except on this one, I've used a very tight tension and a very short golden loop. And here I've used a very loose tension and a very tall golden loop. And so these are techniques that you can use, changing your hook size, changing your tension, and changing your golden loop to create a gauge swatch that matches the gauge swatch that your designer made, so that you can come up with a finished item that is exactly the right size and will make you feel great wearing it. Thanks for joining me today, and happy crocheting.